It was filming me at the computer. The production standards are really high here. You notice that very high tech. The big microphone, impressive, huh? It's called a blue snowball. Yes. Okay, so a head right. Oh, who was the owner of the plantation who would start growing tobacco? Yeah. Burgess? He was a Burgess, which is another term for like a country gentleman. Close though, yeah. Rolfe, yeah. John Rolfe. Who did John Rolfe marry? Pocahontas, yeah. And that would cement it with the Powhatans. But what does tobacco cultivation do to the land? Yeah, leaches out the soil. So they're always looking for more land westward. And that would get them in contact with the Powhatans. And how did the Virginians defeat the Powhatans? Victory, right? Poisoned wine. And as they saw, we're the good guys, so we can do anything we want. Which is always scary when you think you're noble and good, so you can do whatever you want. That's actually kind of terrifying. It's shocking how many people do that. And to move westward, head rights, we got indentured service. And remember, they're citizens, so they have that contract. When they pulled into Jamestown, what did the dandies do when they first got there? They dumped the supplies out and shoveled sand. Shoveled sand. You remember those ships? The Susan Constant, the Good Speed, and the Discovery. It's one of those weird things why they just stuck in my head. That'd be a good bonus question on the test. I don't know. I'm just throwing things out. Susan Constant, Good Speed, and Discovery. So let's talk about indentured servants. So indentured servants came over, and this is the bottom of the bottom. They are slaves. And don't forget, that shows you how bad things were in England. I mean, things have to be just hell for you to agree to become a slave. And so when they got there, did I mention seasoning? Yeah, seasoning is that first 6 months. I'm going to do it on the board because I just want to. Sometimes I like to write. Well, I try to do everything PowerPoint because, we had half the class. Remember, we had the split classes. I kind of try to drive that out of my memory. Let's hope we don't go back to that. I don't think so. So, that first 6 months. But malaria was key. By the way, how do you spell malaria? That look right? That is my R's. For me, that's a pretty good R. And that's a pretty good A. I'm kind of proud of myself.
Yeah, that's right.
You might want to take a picture of that. But it's copyrighted, so you want to get a pay. So did I mention there were 2 types of malaria? There were 2 types of malaria that really affected Europeans. So malaria came up from Africa and then across. It was sweeping through England too at the same time. And so people north of the Sahara really were hammered by 2 types of malaria. And so when the first indentured servants arrived, malaria would just ravage them. That's why they called it seasoning. You can survive that first month of seasoning, you might live. It's always been understated how many people actually died, but probably between 40 and 50% of the people of European descent who came over died in those first 6 months, which is much higher than people believe. They just thought it was about 10 to 20%. But a lot of those contracts and records have been lost or just misplaced, or no one could believe there's that many. And they do the same thing with slaves. Those first 6 months were seasoning. But remember, indentured servants are slaves too, because they have that little piece of paper. Now, at the same time, African slaves are being brought over first by Portuguese, and then the Dutch and the British jumped into the slave trade too. Sub-Saharan Africa. So people born in the southern part of Africa, and I think first period I did get to this, so you have this, I think. Yeah. South of the Sahara Desert, they're not as near as susceptible to one of the 2 forms of malaria. They're still really susceptible to one of the 2 forms, but only one. So Europeans are more at risk. Do you see an advantage than do you have African slaves? Yes, they go through seasoning. Yes, they go through hell. The absolute terror and just dislocation of most African slaves agreed to become slaves, thinking it would be like an indentured servitude to pay off the debt, and then they were kidnapped from there, and then sold to European traders, which, for some reason, to me, that makes it even more horrific than like captured in war, which people usually say. They willingly do it, saying, I'm paying off a debt, and that's how you know they're on a boat. Done, they're kidnapped. So African slaves being brought over, that's a key element. That is not as susceptible to malaria. The Spanish have already discovered this. And so, we have indentured servants, and now we have the slaves. African slaves, not as susceptible to one form of malaria. So they are more in demand. Now, don't think about color of skin. I'm not saying that people do not know this color of skin, but race, in fact, the term race does not even exist yet. And so that was irrelevant. There was already a sub-Saharan slave trade. There's a slave trade all through the Mediterranean. And so slaves from West Africa and East Africa were being brought up either across the Sahara. As the Portuguese went around, and we can see it on this map over here, so I'm going to cross, I have obstacles in my way. The Portuguese began trading this way, but there are already slaves being brought across Sahara, or East Africa after the Red Sea, and then traded through Egypt, which was then it was already becoming part of the Ottoman Empire. And so spread throughout Europe. But there were other people being enslaved too. The Ottomans enslaved pretty much anybody they captured. They were pirates all the way through the 19th century. Europeans would capture Ottomans and enslave them, so some of them made them over to the New World. So many people from this part of the world were captured that the term, have you ever heard anybody who's Slavic? That's where the term slave comes from. And so many were enslaved. So this hodgepodge of people being enslaved had nothing to do with color of skin. It was a little bit to do with saying we're going to enslave people who aren't Christian. But they didn't really care. They just were enslaving people. They do work that nobody else would do. They wouldn't pay enough. But it sort of makes sense. When the Portuguese came here, they're already sailing. The Spanish need people, so they began to trade. And that is why the vast majority of Africans who were forced over either went to the Caribbean or Brazil. That's why, for example, Cuba is about 70 to 75% people of African descent. So, that's the African slave trade. We will talk more about this down the road, but we're just setting up now. But don't forget, it had nothing to do with color. It just happened to be they were enslaved. But they didn't have that piece of paper saying that they'll be free. Everyone got that? Also, various American Indian tribes were taken. So the native population, and the reason I'm saying native is because the Spanish did the same thing. Have you ever heard of Ponce de Leon? When I was in elementary school, I had a teacher, Mr. Walker, my fourth grade teacher. And for some reason, he just loved the story of Ponce de Leon in the 16th century, about 1519 or so, going to Florida, looking for the Fountain of Youth. Have you ever heard that before? The Fountain of Youth. And he just thought that was great. What would you do? I remember we had writing a little essay as a fourth grader. What would you do if you had the Fountain of Youth and you live forever? Like, hang out. I don't know, but watch cartoons. But cartoons were a big deal when I was a kid. Okay. Saturday morning cartoons. But he really wasn't. Fountain of Youth, sure. He was on a slave hunting expedition. That's why he really went to Florida. And so, enslaved. But a little less susceptible to disease, but still very susceptible. The population, so they did the same thing and enslaved people in Virginia. They died of disease or ran away. Think of the other great advantage of Africans. When they got there, they didn't know the terrain. Much harder to run away. Oh, they would join tribes. In Brazil, kind of a slave kingdom would be created. Same thing in where Belize is in Central America. For a while, that was like that. Slaves running away from the Spanish colonies. So, slaves. Most of them were treated like indentured servants. They would be given freedom sometime down the road. In fact, that was the way to keep them working. You work, don't run away, you'll get a head right in 10 years. Whatever the master decided. There's no, the kids would be free. It was all a gray area. Didn't have that piece of paper. That's such a big deal. And so, people getting head rights, different degrees of head rights, some good head rights, some bad head rights. What kind of land would they get? They work hard for 7 years, or slaves would just get it down the road. What land would they get? Yeah.
They get the worst land.
They get the land that the soil is already leached out. Yeah. So the head rights would be, they went through seasoning, they survived, they went through hell for 7 years or whatever it might be, and then their head right would be the worst land they could get. The head right would be one of two lands. Either the land that is leached out, the old tobacco land, or what's the other kind of land? Remember, they're moving westward. Now, this is the thing. In 1670, the Wild West was right about here. So they're pushing westward because they need more land constantly to grow their tobacco and make money. And one thing we'll talk, and I'll talk about this more later, anybody involved in agriculture was always in debt. Always in debt. So they got to pay their debt back. Farmers only get money once a year for the most part. So the rest of the year, you have to borrow money to get that money and hope it's enough to pay back your debts. All it takes is one bad year. Farming was tough. All jobs can be tough. Agriculture really was. So pushing westward. The various tribes are fighting back. So what land would they give inheritance? If they want to go here, they give them head right here, up further westward. They give them the most west land. So who would be attacked by the various tribes trying to defend their land? Those poor indentured servants. The system's rigged against them. I mean, their slaves at the bottom of the barrel have nothing. They finally get independent, and they won't be able to pay back their debts, and they'll probably end up working for somebody, almost like an indentured servant again, or they might be killed on the frontier by people trying to defend their land. The system is rigged against them. Now, there was a colonial legislature, the House of Burgesses, loosely copied on the British Parliament. A Burgess is just a term for a gentleman. These are the big landowners. And so they had a one-house legislature. They just were representatives. Burgesses chose other Burgesses who voted for the Burgesses. They did some tax laws and a few other laws. Remember, they are part of the London Company, but London's really far away. So they're kind of on their own. And they made the laws. They made the most important laws for taxes and for the basic day-to-day operation of the colonies. Do you see a problem for the former indentured servants? Or, remember, many of them might be former slaves who got a head right. It's a whole hodgepodge of people. Who do they complain to? The House of Burgesses are made up of other Burgesses. You think they're going to listen to the indentured servants? They're the very same people who are setting up the system that's rigged against them. They have no representation. Nobody listens to them. By the way, I should be clear about this. Yes, they believe that it was majority rule within the House of Burgesses, but only a tiny percentage of people actually made the decisions on voting, and then were members of the House of Burgesses. The biggest landholders. So, they had no one to talk to, no representation. So along the frontier, they're being attacked, they're going broke, they have no rights, they have no legal rights, and this is all these people. Poor whites with property, all the way to slaves. And that is where we begin in 1676, what rebellion? That's Bacon's rebellion. read books, read things, they'll focus on the actual intricate parts of the rebellion. Yeah, Nathaniel Bacon would help lead it. His big thing was he was a relatively big landholder, and he wanted more troops to put down the various tribes on the frontier so they could protect. That was his big issue. But very quickly, it blew up to something much bigger. As Bacon in Western Virginia, now Western Virginia is right about here, said we have to march on the new capital of Virginia, Williamsburg. It's close to Jamestown. Jamestown's in the swamp. So they moved to a little better place. And that's a place, if you go there today, it still operates like it's 1700. They have all these reenactors. And it's a really cool place, if you ever get a chance. But we're going to march on the House of Burgesses and demand rights, protection along the frontier, but also land. We want land that we can use. If we get land we can't use, we will quickly become nothing but second or third class citizens, no better than what we were before. And if we're killed on the frontier, obviously no better. So they're going to march on Williamsburg, and all the underclass join, which is the vast majority of people in the colony. So we're talking everybody from indentured servants, African slaves, American Indian slaves, also whatever slaves happen to be there, there's kind of a hodgepodge. But then people had a head right, and that includes people of European, African, American descent. I mean, this is a massive group of people from all different backgrounds, all different colors of skin. They all join. Does everyone got that? This is really important. It's all, which by the way, they greatly outnumber the Burgesses. We're talking 10 to 1. Greatly outnumbered. The Burgesses panicked and sent out, what do you call, there were no regular British soldiers there. What do you call citizens who would train a little bit? Yeah, militia. And they all had a militia, not only because of the Spanish, but because American Indian attack and the big Eagle slave rebellion. Trust me, we'll talk more about the slave rebellion and militia. There was a militia. My A's get a little bit vague. Militia. What is the militia here in Montana? We have a militia. The National Guard. Created by law in 1877. That's another one we'll get to. But they said the militia. What kind of people make up the militia? Most of them are the very same people who are rebelling, and they joined. They joined the rebellion and started marching on Williamsburg. It's like, yeah, you're right, we are being cheated. Let's go. Can you imagine the panic of the very wealthy? They immediately said, please send troops. They sent to the nearest US, British naval base, which was in, nearest British naval base was in the Caribbean. Please help us. The only thing that saved the Burgesses was that fall came and they're all farmers, so they had to go back and harvest. Bacon died of disease along the way, and so they were able to put down the rebellion. So the rebellion was put down. But it looked like this rebellion might spread everywhere. Everyone got that. The rebellion was put down. Can you imagine the panic? We can't allow this to happen again. So the House of Burgesses began passing laws. What were the laws? Slave codes. Slave codes. Laws that will apply to slaves. Every slave society has these laws. They have to make sure that slaves will run away, keep the system of coercion and torture to force people to work, and the fear of slave rebellion. But they organized these slave codes. Now they were kind of there, but they really clarified it. And the reason why is they wanted to divide the lower class to make sure they don't unify and do it again. And this is a key element. They want to make sure this does not happen again. And so they gave more they gave legal rights to citizens. Who were citizens? They had that piece of paper that said they're indentured servants. So even indentured servants who, and not all legal rights, but some legal rights. Yeah, they still couldn't pick the House of Burgesses, but they had a right, for example, to testify in trial. But if you weren't a citizen, you couldn't testify. And indentured servants had that piece of paper. And that piece of paper was everything. They're citizens. Slaves did not have that. So they did not have these rights. The most important of these rights were a series of laws called the Fornication Laws. Now, I did not get to this on Friday because I didn't. So let's very quickly talk about the Fornication Laws. Everyone quick get it out? Fornication Laws. Now, you'll notice I have the first one in 1691. And I know it comes after the law before, but it's the most important one, so I wanted to make sure that was before. You know, it's 1691. It's 15 years after Reagan's rebellion. Now you might think, that's 15 years, that's a long time. Well, things moved a lot slower, but also think in terms of kind of trial and error, coming up with something. And so this is really important. So it talks about whether or not children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free. Now there were free people of African descent. They had head rights. But the vast majority were African slaves. And we'll talk about this more. The first African slaves that came to Jamestown, probably by Portuguese traders, it was probably 1617, but we're not 100% sure. So most people say 1619 because we know for sure. The date doesn't, I mean, the date is not as important as what came out of it. So let's look at this. Yes? Hmm? Go ahead. So, if you look at this, first up, what were the masters doing? What do you call it if they're having children with female slaves? What are the masters doing to the female slaves? They're raping their slaves. So they're raping their slaves. And by the way, they knew they would. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, no one told us this was bad. No, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were raping their slaves. Why were they doing it? Because they could. They're raping them. And one of the process, and you know what they call it, fornication, implying it's a sin by both the man and the woman, because they're out of what? Remember I told you that before. But they know what's really going on. But who's writing the laws? The very same people that are doing what? And they don't want people to know they're raping their slaves. Even though everyone knows this is endemic in slavery. Slavery, they're raping their slaves. Just what happens in slavery. So don't forget that if you ever go to the South and see those wonderful, majestic mansions where these slave owners live. Don't forget, that's what was happening. But how did they draw the web? Oh, and what else the masters? They have children. They want to make sure the children don't get what? Say it again. Inheritance. Are they going to get the same inheritance as their kids with their wife? They don't want that. They don't want to divide that up. They don't want them to get the land or get anything. Or the mother might say, hey, I had your kid. I want to be free. No, they don't want that. So how did they solve the problem? Everyone look at that. It's kind of amazing in its logic. What did they decide? We have this problem. A slave has a child. How do we decide? Or be whipped, yeah. Or, but what happens to the child? Forget that. What happens to the child? Yeah. Exactly. They are free or slave based upon their mother. So the female slave, actually, the law says he or she gets paid. The master or slave either pays a fine or gets whipped, but we all know who's going to be whipped in this, right? But then the big thing about the fornication laws, if the mother is a slave, the child is a slave. Problem solved, right? So if the slave has a child, female slave, it's slave. Doesn't matter who the father is, it's slave. Doesn't matter. That is part of the reason why the significant majority of people of African descent in the United States are also of European descent. Significant number. But we'll get to that in a second.
So it says later that in default of payment, they'll be taken possession by the parish.
Parish is counted.
Yeah.
So they're taking it.
Yeah. So they're. Right.
But who is that for?
Oh.
Indentured servants.
Yeah.
You'd be good job reading it, but so indentured servants, they just cheat the women who are indentured servants in Netherlands. And the question, yeah.
I was just, that last year when we read it to the law.
Oh yeah.
We were accusing like black people for doing I know it was a really long one, but it was not as common as people made it sound.
No. It was just like this great fear of white men. If something like that was thought to have happened, there's a very good chance that they would torture the person the black man they abused.
Okay, so it didn't really, else do I even have?
No, they would be totally ostracized. It was such a social factor. Because I mean, it did happen, but not as much. But one other thing too is there were so few free women in the colonies. It happened more with indentured servants of European descent than African descent, but rarely than us because we're so few. And by the way, torture to death, you might have heard that term called lynch or lynching. That is torturing somebody. We normally think of hanging, at least I do, but it's actually just the whole horrific process. So, they're slaves. So think about what this changes. If you have that little piece of paper saying you're a citizen, your kids are what? If you have a piece of paper. Say it again. Yeah, they're citizens, and therefore they're free. Right? If you don't have that paper, your kids are slaves. What have they just created? And please get this down. They created permanent slavery. Doesn't it? It's not permanent? It's permanent. So when I was growing up, I remember we had little things about slavery when I was in elementary school and things like that. And just I knew about it. I always thought it was like this permanent slavery, just slaves are slaves. No, that did not exist until this. What did every colony do? They copied this law. Every colony would copy this law. Permanent slavery. So by 1740s or 1720, South Carolina would just make the slave law and say children of slaves are slaves. They didn't go through the whole thing, they just set it. But there's something else. So much about that piece of paper also happened to have a color factor. What color skin did most of the people have that had that piece of paper? They were kind of this light tannish color that for whatever reason they call white. So of European descent. Other people were not of European descent. And how long did it take people to start saying, maybe the freedom is not the piece of paper of citizenship, it's color of skin. And by the way, is it easier then to enforce if you just go to color of skin? Slavery was not based on color of skin, but this turned out to be color of skin. So why were whites free and blacks permanent slaves? First, because we have a piece of paper. Pretty soon, maybe whites are better. Maybe whites are better. Why do whites have legal rights and people who aren't white don't have legal rights? Maybe whites are better. And by the way, most white people had almost nothing. That gave me something to have, didn't it? I don't have much, but I'm white. What did they just create out of the slave codes? Racism. This is where racism comes from. Racism did not exist. Now, I want to be very clear. The House of Burgesses were not sitting there, in a small room. Remember, they're all smoking tobacco. God said, okay, let's create racism. No, they just didn't want another rebellion. But once you create this divide by race, won't it be really hard for poor whites to join together with poor blacks? They'll fight each other. And who stays on top? Racism is economic. It comes from class. This whole thing was class. And that's what race is. Those on top want to make sure they kept their wealth. They didn't mean to create it. The country was not created for that reason, but now it's there. And its tentacles would go everywhere, because every colonial power would do that. Wouldn't this justify colonization for years? We could take it because we're white and we're superior. And if people who are not white would look at it and say, well, maybe we are inferior. They seem to have all this stuff. And it's really an incredible moment. So that's the short ID for tomorrow, one of the choices. We'll finish the fornication laws tomorrow. Sound good? It's a big moment. That's a good copy. Yeah, it's really good. Still your pen. There we go. That's kind of my signature. We'll go from there. Have a great day, everybody. Right when you find work. And arguably, hang by your thumbs. So you were gone and now you're back, Grace? Now you're back. I don't know if you can send me that stuff. Big partner today. See you tomorrow. Okay, I hit this in like 10 times. I should. So fun. There you go. Oh, you. Look it in. Push it. Push it. Push it. Frisbee.
I wasn't there. I was on my phone and my phone was yeah, but he was okay. I was not on my phone. I was not. I think wait, no. I had a Lindsay. Me and Lindsay had
Ready?
You did? I did. I didn't know I actually.
Oh.
It just went up in the air and then it went back down. Right, well, there goes that. Sorry, I'm not getting this We are. We're gonna like have friendship bracelets. Emma, I did that. I walk into him and I'm like, I'm gonna go to the bathroom, but she's like, okay. And then I'm like,
who would like a quiz today?
I literally walked up to the doorway and I was like, bro, yeah.
There we go. You're gonna go far in life.
Am I?
Oh, what a play!
Guys, I'm kind of scared. I was literally 5 minutes to my last concert. There was a line at the bathroom. I keep putting my bathroom. I need my bathroom.
Okay, take out action paper number 1 to 1,000.
We don't have a bathroom.
It'll take about 3 days.
All right.
Are you sitting here? Do you like the orange pen? Black. I used black in special topics and it did not erase. It was kind of bad.
Orange is like more fun.
This is all the with the well, like this is all.
That's so cute.
It's also like even really small.
Half sheet of paper, you may use your notes. So anything you put down on that packet.
Oh, it's so great.
I know I'm recording, but I am done recording. You guys.
What color?